You think your little secret contract means anything. You are nothing but a murderer!
She signed a contract.
Explicitly state that Jinwook's bloodline takes precedence over her meaningless service. They mock her uniform and her background, effectively disowning her from the life she shared with him for years. This establishes the moral stakes. A woman who was the ultimate observer and family scapegoat being bullied by those who lived in luxury, while she did the heavy lifting. Welcome to our community, your ultimate destination for gripping stories of the Korean Mafia, underworld power, and forbidden interracial romance. Dive into thrilling Mafia stories filled with dangerous love, betrayal, obsession, and passion set in the dark and mysterious underworld. Our stories feature powerful Korean Mafia bosses, strong female leads, and intense romantic connections that cross cultures and boundaries. If you love Mafia romance, Korean drama vibes, billionaire love stories, this channel is for you. Subscribe for weekly uploads of addictive Mafia stories, Korean underworld romance, and dramatic storytelling that will keep you hooked till the end. If you want to see how this story goes, stay with me until the very end. And as we begin, hit that like button and tell me in the comments what you feel about this story. The scent of white lilies was suffocating, thick and heavy enough to drown the expensive ozone of the funeral parlor. Zaraya stood beside the mahogany casket of Jinwook, her warm, glowing skin smudged with the soot of a life spent in the shadows of his service. She was the ultimate observer, a woman who had spent years as a pauper in a house of opulent greed, yet she stood with a calm confidence that the mourning family found alarmingly still. The meaningful silence of the memorial was shattered by a sharp, predatory cry. Veronica Hale, dressed in aggressive black silk and pearls, stepped forward, her sharp-faced features contorted into a mask of righteous indignation. She did not whisper her cruelty. She spoke loudly enough for every watchful guest and neighbor to hear, and that was not an accident. "That house doesn't belong to you anymore, Zaraya," Veronica hissed, her finger pointing like a blade. "You are a gold-digging maid who will leave this family with nothing but the clothes on your back." Beside her, Minho, the aggressor brother, stepped into Zaraya's personal space, his athletic frame coiled with a predatory annoyance. His voice was a low, dangerous rasp as he reinforced the unfair trade. "The estate has been reviewed," he stated, his narrow perspective blinded by the liquid assets he believed he already owned. "Ownership of the mansion, the accounts, and every high-end appliance has legally transferred to the part of the family that shares his blood." Zaraya did not step back. She didn't raise her voice or allow a single tear to fall. She had already cried her authentic grief alone on a kitchen floor 3 nights ago. Her fingers rested lightly against the contract signed in secret she held against her chest, a visual proof of a strategic endgame the family could not yet see. "So that's how you're saying it," Zaraya replied, her tone smooth and unmoved. "We're being generous giving you until the end of the week to clear out," Minho snapped, his organized certainty masking the first crack of doubt. They saw her as a worthless thief, a family scapegoat finally being purged from their hollow empire. They believed they had won a total victory by seizing what was visible, unaware that Jinwook, the controlled king, had spent years building a boundary they would never be able to breach. Zaraya nodded once, her military-grade composure holding firm as the storm finally arrived at her door. The predatory energy in the room shifted from aggression to a cold, calculating hunger as Zaraya stepped aside from the doorway. She did not rush to pack the few belongings she possessed as a pauper in their eyes. Instead, she offered an invitation that caught the Hale family off guard. "You've been planning this for a while," she said, her voice dropping into a low, gravelly vibration of calm confidence. "You might as well see what you've taken." The invitation wasn't warm, but it wasn't hostile either. It was controlled, and that made it dangerous in a way Veronica and Minho couldn't quite name. They stepped inside one by one, moving through the foyer like they already belonged there, their intense eyes scanning the opulent surroundings for anything they might have missed. The mansion still smelled of Jinwook, a scent of expensive ozone and structured intention that even death couldn't fully erase. Zaraya walked ahead of them, not as a guide, but as a woman already separate from the hollow empire they were so eager to claim. She led them into the living room, where the visual proof of Jinwook's life was being turned into a spreadsheet of liquid accounts and asset distribution. Minho moved with precise movements, touching the mahogany surfaces and calculating the equity, his narrow perspective seeing only the solid property. It was a home, Zaraya corrected quietly, her fingers resting lightly against the frame of a portrait they had already decided to sell. Not anymore, Veronica snapped, her sharp-faced expression filled with predatory annoyance as she watched Zaraya move with rhythmic independence. The family was prepared, organized, and certain that this was the end of the story. They believed that control comes from possession, and as they stood in the center of the sprawling, empty palace, they felt the high-stakes rush of a total victory. Zaraya watched them from the mezzanine of her own meaningful silence, noting how they focused only on the visible success. She didn't react when Minho demanded to know if all known accounts had been transferred. She simply nodded once, a truth revealed only to herself. They were celebrating a hollow victory. They had taken the house, the cars, and the high-end appliances, but they had ignored the one property and the system Jinwook had protected exclusively for her. As the door finally closed behind their loud celebration, Zaraya allowed herself a small, quiet exhale, ready to follow the instructions that would soon undo them. The silence that returned to the mansion was not peaceful. It was a meaningful silence, heavy with the residue of the family's predatory annoyance. Zaraya retreated to her small room, a space that felt separate from the hollow empire upstairs. She did not rush to pack her modest belongings. Instead, she sat on the edge of her bed and reached into a hidden pocket of her soot-smudged uniform to retrieve the small, worn envelope. Her name was written on it in Jinwook's precise, structured handwriting, a visual proof that her presence in his life was never an accident. With precise movements, she opened the seal, her warm skin glowing in the dim light. This was not a moment of internal collapse or desperation. It was a moment of direction. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a key, not the high-tech key to the mansion's glass fortress, but something older, heavier, and far more intentional. She read the instruction once, then again, her intense eyes absorbing the truth revealed in his words. "If they take everything else, let them," the letter stated with military-grade clarity. "They'll think it's over. It won't be." Jinwook, the controlled king, had not left her safety to chance or a billion-dollar portfolio that his family could easily acquire through greed. He had built a boundary, a controlled network of assets that didn't rely on public visibility. The family had been so focused on the liquid accounts and solid property, they could see that they had completely ignored the one property and the system he had actually protected. Something behind Zaraya's eyes settled into a calm confidence. She realized that the pauper identity they had tried to force upon her was her greatest strategic advantage. While Veronica and Minho were busy turning a life into a spreadsheet, Zaraya was following a map to nowhere that led to a position of true power. She folded the letter carefully, picked up the heavier key, and allowed herself a small, quiet exhale. The storm had arrived at her door, but she was no longer just enduring it. She was ready to undo them. The road to the property was not marked on any modern map, splitting off quietly from a worn county route that most drivers would miss unless they already knew it was there. Zaraya did not slow when she reached the turn, steering the wheel with the same calm precision she had shown during the eviction on the porch. In truth, she had only been to this protected location once before, and even then, she hadn't fully understood the meaningful silence of what she was seeing. She wasn't chasing hope or acting out of desperation. She was following instructions left by a man who had treated her as his ultimate observer. The gravel beneath her tires shifted as she moved deeper into the land, where formated tall trees pressed in on both sides to filter the late afternoon light into something quieter and more deliberate. There were no neighbors here, no loud family members, and no watchful eyes to witness her arrival. Just the heavy, intentional distance Jinwook had cultivated. When the farmhouse finally came into view, it didn't announce itself with the opulent flash of the mansion. It stood there like it had been waiting, a structure of weathered wood and wide porches that reflected more sky than secrets. To any of Jinwook's greedy relatives, it would look like a worthless, forgotten property, but to Zaraya, it looked exactly like what it was. Protected. She parked and turned off the engine, but for a moment she didn't move. She wasn't afraid. She was remembering the strategic weight of Jinwook's words from years ago. "You don't need to understand it right now," he had told her with his low, gravelly vibration of a voice. "Just remember how to get here." She had laughed then, calling it a backup plan, but he hadn't joined in her amusement. Not a backup, the controlled king had corrected her. A boundary. Zaraya stepped out of the car into air that felt cleaner but heavier with meaning. She walked up the porch steps slowly, pulling the heavier key from her pocket. The lock didn't resist. It turned like it had been expecting her, inviting the pauper they had discarded into the position of true power he had built for her alone. Under the canopy of the trees, she was finally separate from the hollow empire and ready to discover the system that would soon undo them. Inside the house, the air was untouched, not abandoned, but meticulously maintained. There was no layering of dust on the simple furniture and no signs of decay, as if the place had been cared for consistently by someone who understood its absolute importance. Zaraya moved through the rooms with her eyes sharper and more attentive. This was no longer a space for grief, but one for observation. The controlled king hadn't left anything to chance. She reached into her bag and pulled out the letter again, her eyes scanning the lines with a more deliberate focus. If they take everything else, let them. They'll think it's over. It won't be. Her fingers tightened slightly around the paper as she read the final warning: trust the documents, not the appearances. Her gaze shifted across the room and settled on a door near the back hallway she hadn't remembered. Locked. She reached for the key, and the click of the tumblers echoed louder than it should have in the quiet farmhouse. Inside wasn't another bedroom. It was an office, functional, intentional, and strictly decorative. A desk sat against the far wall, and filing cabinets lined the side, each labeled with Israel's precise, small handwriting. Zaraya stepped inside and closed the door, realizing this wasn't just a property, it was a system. She moved to the desk and pulled out a thick, categorized folder. Her stillness deepened as she scanned the contents: land ownership records for multiple adjacent parcels, agricultural lease agreements, and business filings. This was the moment the story shifted. She sat down slowly, not overwhelmed or shocked, but finally aligning with the truth. Jinwook hadn't just built a forgotten farm. He had constructed a controlled network of revenue streams and storage agreements that didn't rely on public visibility. None of it had been listed with the primary estate, because none of it had ever been in his name. As she reached for another folder, her name appeared repeatedly, not as a beneficiary, but as the legal owner. The pauper they had ridiculed was, in reality, the owner of a foundation they couldn't even see. Jinwook had transferred it all quietly and completely. "They took what they could see," she whispered, her voice steady and controlled. The meaningful silence of the farm was now her greatest weapon, a position of true power that would eventually lead to their total internal collapse. The silence of the protected farmhouse was broken by the crunch of gravel beneath tires. Zaraya did not react immediately. She closed the thick folder of revenue streams, placed it back in the desk drawer, and stood up with precise movements. By the time the front door slammed, she was standing in the center of the living room, waiting with a calm confidence that the house seemed to amplify. Minho stepped in first, his athletic frame tense as he scanned the room with predatory annoyance. Behind him, Veronica Hale entered, her sharp-faced expression tightening as she took in the simple, structured interior. They had not come to offer generosity. They had come because their narrow perspective had finally detected a boundary they didn't control. "I figured you'd come here," Minho said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. He looked around the room, his intense eyes searching for the visual proof of the wealth he believed he was owed. "This place," Jinwook never talked about it. That alone makes it suspicious. "Suspicious," Zaraya repeated, her tone unmoved. She let the meaningful silence stretch between them, noting how their confidence was no longer as solid as it had been at the funeral. Veronica stepped forward, her aggressive black silk rustling in the quiet room. "You should have told us about this," she snapped, her predatory gaze fixing on Zaraya. "Whatever this is, it's part of the estate. You don't get to hide assets from the family." "Hide," Zaraya tilted her head slightly, her military-grade composure making them visibly uncomfortable. He separated what he wanted you to see from what he didn't. Don't play dumb, Minho snarled, stepping into her space to exert force. You're going to transfer ownership of this property and everything tied to it. You don't have a choice. They still believed this was about dominance and obedience, unaware that they were standing in the heart of a system designed to undo them. They saw a pauper in a maid's uniform, failing to realize they were looking at the true owner of the empire's foundation. Zaraya didn't flinch. She simply met Minho's gaze with authentic clarity, realizing that their second mistake was believing that control comes from possession. The storm had arrived at the farmhouse, but Zaraya was no longer just enduring it. She was the one holding the key to their internal collapse. The predatory silence of the farmhouse living room was broken not by a scream, but by the sharp, electronic trill of Minho's phone. He answered with an aggressive flick of his thumb, his athletic frame leaning forward as if to physically intimidate the voice on the other end. Veronica watched him with watchful, sharp-faced expectation, her narrow perspective, already anticipating the total victory that would finally cast Zaraya into the gutter. Well, Minho demanded, his tone a low, dangerous rasp of predatory annoyance. But the family lawyer's voice was slower than usual, heavy with a measured reveal of a reality they hadn't outplanned. I'm going to say this carefully, the lawyer began, his words cutting through their organized certainty like a blade. The property you are standing on, along with every surrounding parcel and revenue stream tied to it, is not part of the estate. Minho went alarmingly still. What do you mean it's not part of the estate? Everything he owned belongs to us. Everything in his name does, the lawyer replied, the truth revealed hitting the room with a pressurized weight. But Israel Kincaid didn't own this. It's been under the name of Zaraya Mitchell for years. The phone slipped slightly in Minho's grip as he looked at Zaraya, his intense eyes filling with a shocked disbelief that signaled the first stage of his internal collapse. Veronica's aggressive black silk rustled as she stepped forward, her predatory gaze faltering. They realized in a single, devastating moment that the hollow empire they had seized, the mansion, the cars, the liquid accounts, was merely the surface. They had taken what was visible, but Zaraya held the foundation. Zaraya did not smirk or celebrate. She remained unmoved. Her calm confidence acting as a boundary they could no longer breach. He separated what he wanted you to see from what he didn't, she said quietly, her voice a low, gravelly vibration of authentic power. The controlled king had not used force to protect her. He had used strategic thinking and meaningful silence. As Bernard and Veronica stood in the center of the intentional farmhouse, they finally understood that their total victory was a hollow illusion. They had won the wrong battle, and the woman they called a pauper was now the only one standing on solid property. The meaningful silence of the farmhouse office felt heavier than the expensive ozone of the mansion they had stolen. Minho's organized certainty had completely dissolved into a low, dangerous rasp of desperation. He straightened his suit, trying to regain the precise movements of a man in control, but his intense eyes betrayed his internal collapse. All right, Minho began, his tone shifting to something smoother, more calculated. Be reasonable. We're all adults here. Zaraya did not respond. She stood near the window, looking out at the protected land that stretched toward the horizon, her calm confidence acting as a boundary he couldn't cross. We made a mistake, Minho continued, his voice thinner than before. We were focused on the primary estate, the house, the visible accounts. We didn't realize Jinwook had built such a complex system here. He gestured toward the filing cabinets filled with revenue streams and agricultural leases that were legally hers. We can come to an arrangement, a fair one. Veronica stepped forward, her sharp-faced aggression replaced by a predatory smile that didn't reach her eyes. We keep the mansion and the public assets, she said, her voice dripping with organized greed. You keep this farm and the secondary holdings. We'll acknowledge you as part of the family, properly this time. Zaraya finally turned to face them. Her military-grade composure remained unmoved by their offer. You stood on the porch of the house I shared with him for years and made sure the neighbors heard you disown me, she said quietly, her tone even and certain. You called me a gold-digging pauper and took everything you could see because you believed control comes from possession. We're trying to fix that, Minho snapped, his predatory annoyance resurfacing as the negotiation failed to move her. No, Zaraya replied, her voice a low, gravelly vibration of authentic sovereignty. You're trying to recover assets you realized you don't own. You told me I wasn't family. I'm simply agreeing with you. The room went still. The vultures realized that force and pressure were useless against someone who no longer needed anything from them. This wasn't a trade, it was closure. Zaraya had spent years as the ultimate observer, and she knew that while they measured value by what they could take quickly, she held what was truly valuable. She didn't need their arrangement to be a queen. She was already standing on the foundation they had ignored. The meaningful silence that followed Minho and Veronica's departure was not a void, but a foundation. Zaraya remained on the wide porch of the farmhouse, her calm confidence anchored in the land that stretched out before her, a boundary that had finally become her sovereign territory. She did not smile or celebrate their internal collapse. Her military-grade composure was far too intentional for such a display. Instead, she simply sat there in a place that had never been meant to impress the loud and the greedy, only to endure. She watched their car disappear down the road that wasn't marked on any modern map, noting how they left much quieter than they had arrived. There was no total victory for them to bring back to the city, only the slow, devastating realization that everything they thought they had secured had already slipped past them. They had focused only on the visible success, the mansion and the liquid accounts, while Zaraya, the ultimate observer, had been out planning them alongside a man who knew that real power is rarely displayed on the surface. Zaraya looked down at her hands, still smudged with the soot of her past life, and realized that her pauper identity had been the very thing that allowed her to see what they had ignored. Greed had narrowed their perspective, making them blind to the power that was structured quietly and protected intentionally. They believed control came from possession and force, but Zaraya now understood that the strongest position is the one that remains standing when everything else has been stripped away. As the twilight deepened into a bruised purple over the fields, Zaraya felt the king's protection not as a gift, but as a system she was now the owner of. She was no longer the family scapegoat or the invisible maid. She was the new queen of a controlled network they would never understand. She stood up, her rhythmic independence guiding her back inside the house that had been waiting for her. The story of the gold digger was over, and the era of the woman who held the key to the foundation had begun. Here comes the end of the story. If the story moved you, subscribe, like, and share.